This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. We will also explore threats to meaningful engagement in sport and movement culture practices and ask questions about what we can learn about the human condition through our involvement in sport. The guests are leading scholars in human and social sciences of sport who share their explorations in a scholarly as well as a personal context. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. Today's episode is the second part of our discussion with Petter Kukkonen, where we learn about sport in ancient Greece. In the first part, which I recommend you to check out, Petter started sharing about his own journey as an athlete and how retirement from sport was a turning point for him and led him to study history, religions, and philosophy. While working as a professional coach, for several years he was writing a novel on sport in ancient Greece. The book was published a few months ago in Finnish, and the title would be translated, Olive Trees Never Die. In the first part of the discussion with Petter, we started asking questions such as, what would be the key differences and similarities between sport back then compared to sport as we know it today? What was the cultural significance of sport? How can we imagine athletes approach their sport, and what was its purpose? Today's discussion continues these explorations. Our guest, Petter Kukkonen, is a former athlete in Nordic combined, and currently he is the head coach of the Finnish national team. While we also discuss his current coaching role, the main reason he is with me today is not because of his job, but because of his novel, which tells the story of Alekos, a wrestler who grew up in Athens during the time of Plato and Aristotle and trained to compete in the Olympic Games. This fascinating book has 750 pages, and it provides a glimpse to life and sport in a very different world, also helping us to reflect on our lives and our sports today. I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. But so in ancient world we cannot understand it without mentioning religion, but we also cannot understand that without mentioning philosophy. And you are mentioning that our hero of the story, Alekos, he lived at the same time as Plato and Aristotle, and you also have these scenes in your book where these philosophers appear. So it would be exciting. You can maybe share a little bit about those storylines in the book.
Just before Olympic Games, Alekos is invited with his stepbrother Dionysius to Academia, which was the place where Plato's gymnasium was located, and they had exhibition wrestling match. First Alekos against Dionysius, and then Plato was one of spectators, and then he wanted to challenge Alekos. And Plato, he actually had a history of competing in wrestling in few, not in Olympic Games, but few of these highly respected games in Greece. So he was in real life also a really strong wrestler, but at the time he was already 63 years old. So, but they are having this wrestling match with Alekos, and then afterwards having some wine and talking, and I didn't want to bring any detailed philosophy of Plato, but it's some kind of main lines about his thinking. And then there's also Aristotle. In their younghood, I think they're at the age of 17 or 16. Alekos is actually a couple of years older than Aristotle, and they're spending a Panathenaia, which was 7 days long local big festival in Athens. They're spending that festival together, like going to theater and hanging around, drinking a little bit wine, talking about philosophy, and so that kind of approaches or encounters with those two big names.
And yeah, you mentioned that you didn't want to go into detail about the philosophy of Plato or Aristotle, but I think it's quite a nice way of kind of tying in those historical figures, which brings to the question that I didn't remember to ask yet, was that did you have a character or a historical character that you draw inspiration from when you are building your character Alekos, or is he like a combination of different stories and sources, or how did he come to be as he is?
He's for sure a combination of different kind of ideas. There must be part of me in his thinking, and there is part of fiction. And my biggest hero in this literature is Mika Valtari, and I really love his characters, and I would say I have like copied a little bit of his characters he used in his books. So it's kind of like a combination of these three things.
Yeah. Do we have any stories that we have available about the athletes of those times? Do we have any sources about? We know generally about sport and we know generally about the Olympics, but do we have any histories of those athletes who were actually doing that?
Yeah, we do have something mostly about stories how, for example, Croton of Milo, which was like 6-time Olympic winner, how he was like picking the cow in his shoulder and carried it for, 10 stadiums and then drinking 9 liters of wine after that one, or how they lift some rocks which were the weight of 7 men. Like that kind of story. But we have to remember that they couldn't measure time or results in that time, so it would be really interesting to compare the results, but unfortunately we cannot do it. But that would be just like fun, because it was like really absolute top sport culture that they started at the age of 7 or 8 years, and they continued it till I don't know, till adults when they were 40 or 50 years old. And there's, for example, what tells you something about the top sport is about the story about Theagenes. He was a boxer, and then he was also doing pankration, and pankration, we can call it kind of free fight, which we also have this time. So he won during his sport career. He only won, or only the victories he had was 1,400 together. So if I'm like counting fast, it's if he had like 20 years long career, he had only not only, but he had 70 victories per year. So that tells us some kind of picture how much they were competing. So they were like totally professional athletes who trained, and then they just had time only for going for one competition to other. And we must remember there were no like planes or cars to drive, so they had to use ships or even travel or hike by themselves from city states to another to have these competitions. And
if you think of professional sport as we know it today seems to be like many athletes in different sports have a very hectic schedule, that they are often on the plane and on tour. And not necessarily now with the COVID situation, but typically we think of that it can be very tiring life as well. But I guess when we read and learn about the ancient Greece and the sport they played, it's not only now that athletes have had like a massively busy schedule.
Yeah.
Do we know anything about how long the career would have been at that time? Like how long can you keep doing that?
Actually, I'm not sure about that, but my feeling is like the story of Theagenes. I think like his career lasted easily 20 years or even more. So so that other stories that I have read, I had a little bit like same kind of understanding that many of those, they had like many times Olympic winners, and then they keep going as long as they like really they stayed in top, and it was not like they ended up for 20 years at the age of 20 or 25 because they had to go to studying or they had to go to work. It was their life to be in sport, to be in top sport. Yeah, that's my best guess.
And after, I mean, we started our discussion about you finishing your athletic career, and what has happened since is the topic of our talk. Do we know anything about these athletes in ancient Greece? Like, what happened to them when they stopped competing at the top level? Like, how would their life paths continue from there?
That's also something that I really don't have a clear answer, but I would guess many of those started coaching career because they had this tradition of history and all the relationship needed. So they were coaches, and then they just had free time as seniors and having fun and remembering their nice stories in sport field.
I guess the problem is often that, when you no longer compete, you kind of disappear from the public eye. So it's not anymore like, even in our times, like we don't necessarily hear anything about the former top athletes unless they run into some real trouble and then they end up in the news. But many of them we really don't hear in the media about what happened to them next. So I would guess that in ancient Greece as well, that after you don't compete in Olympics anymore, you might not end up in the history books.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I also started to think about that topic now when you mentioned it, what happened to those. And of course, many of them were most probably super rich guys who didn't need any support from government anymore. But then there might have been also lots of those guys who used all their money that they earned during their sport career, and then when they finally end up their career, city-state probably say that, okay, now you won't get your apartment for free anymore, not food for free anymore, and so not the income. So they might have faced like many problems which we don't know. And I think that's pretty much tells about the history, that they were not like writing that much about bad things or like we have now tradition of pointing out every possible things that are gone wrong in our times, but that's like mostly written by the ones who had the big victories and who took over the world. So it was just like this positive talking about things what happened and how things went.
Yeah, my next question would be, when you said about these top athletes who succeeded and they competed successfully, and you said that they would be then getting an apartment and getting food from, was it the city-state or who was their sponsor at the time?
Yes, it was city-state. They made the decision in the council to provide all this kind of advantage to best athletes. And
right.
And one thing what was also interesting is that like other city-states, they could buy those athletes. They wanted to like hire those athletes to their own cities to make their sport power bigger. Let's say they hired good runners from Croton to some other nations, or good Spartan wrestler to other city-states. So that's also used in that time to make your city-state look stronger.
So, I mean, do we know how hard was it? Tough competition to get to the position of professional athlete. Like our times, we talk a lot about the problems of the elite sports system. If you think of football academies around the world, and we know that less than 1% of the young boys who all want to be the next star, they dedicate their lives to the sport, and then we know that over 99% don't become professional footballers, and we know about many of them have difficulties and then finding their life path after they get deselected. Do we know about ancient Greece? Was there a tough competition, or were there a lot of young men who aspired to become athletes and compete in the Olympics?
I'm sure that they had like really hard fight. Like I say, that the school started around at the age of 7. And they, of course, they had like really different kind of system between city-states. But in Athens, for example, when most of the kids are heading to school and then started sports, so it was pretty natural that kids wanted to fight against each other, who is the best in jumping, who is the best in javelin throw, who is the best wrestler, and so forth. And it was like a natural way to compete. And now we are thinking much more about the disadvantage of competing too early or too hard or something like that.
Yeah.
But for sure, it was like really hard competition. Only the best one and most talented ones with best coaches and best know-how they could race or develop in their career among the best ones. And it's also because they didn't have that many things to choose from. Basically, it was like sports, and then they were heading for army. And like I said also before, that like regular man, they were not, but they were allowed to do some work, but it's basically not something that they were like aiming for to do work. So they didn't have that many options as we have now. So I would say that that's why many kids like they had to, or they wanted to, they loved to choose sports.
So just kind of my guess would be that there would be some of the same problems that what we are now discussing about the elite sports system, about talent development, and about few of them will win, but what happens to the rest who are not good enough, and what are the options? I mean, our times, obviously, there are all these initiatives about supporting athletes' education and making sure they have also other things in their life. I guess that would be something that was not really the central concern for the sports system back then.
Yeah, I bet it was not what they were like focusing, how to make their civil career or some kind of second option or that kind of things happen. It was like all or nothing, and I really don't know what happened to those kids who were not successful. Maybe it was not even that big thing because maybe they were not even thinking, or maybe that kind of failure was, of course, failure was existing, but maybe we are like thinking so much more dramatically what happened to those kids who lost their dreams in sports, who didn't develop on the level they wanted, and that's all just like speculation. But I think their approach was like totally different.
Well, I mean, I very much look forward to finishing the book. I'm at the early stages still, and I don't want to hear whether our main character is actually fulfilling his dream of competing in the Olympics. I only know that he is aiming to compete in the Olympics, so don't tell me that. But I would love to hear reflections on your journey, and you told me at the beginning that part of the push to write this book was about your desire to explore and understand humanity and develop yourself in things other than your athletic skills. So maybe you can a little bit reflect on that journey and what you feel, that how you have maybe learned or changed as a person in this process of writing this wonderful book.
I really hope that there have been lots of changes in me. Of course, there happens lots of changes in 15 years, no matter if I write this book or make all this research. But at least I have much better touch on top sport and also like in all the society. So I feel that there's no things that kind of come like surprises for me. What happens in our time? If there is some kind of corruption or some kind of, I don't know, new techniques or money is involved or whatever it's related to sports, I feel that I have seen it all. It doesn't mean that I don't want to like develop things or like look forward, but somehow there's not like that big surprises, and they're not the things that which make me think that, oh, what is this? I never heard about that, and where does it come from? That is it right or not? And so, so in that manner, I think that I see the things much more in better light. I have the understanding on things around us, and what I can do is implement that kind of things to my work. How I see my athletes, how I approach them, how I use my authority, how I speak to them, how I teach them to understand the world and the sports and if I teach them to understand the world first and then sports, and how I see them in the sport, if I see them, if they're not achieving their goals, if I see them as failures, or if I want to support them or understand that, okay, you may have other chance when you just turn your jacket and go to, I don't know, business world, or you become a musician, or that kind of things. So it's not that black and white for me anymore. It is just like sports, even though it's my passion, and I hope that I can do it for the next 30, 40 years. But still, I see it in different light, and I also see in different light all these big victories. Even though I want to achieve Olympic gold medals with my athletes, but it's not that super important when I know that it is just Olympic gold medals, and you can achieve these goals in many ways by breaking your athletes, making them Olympic winners, but to break them so that they are broken athletes with no self-confidence and confidence, and not like really clear thoughts what is life about, or then I can make them Olympic winners or world champions or best athletes in the world who has wide understanding about the relationship, how the life works, and what's the relationship between healthy family or let's say or healthy and your family, and some values of society, and compared to the big success that you might one time achieve. I don't know, was it too difficult to explain, but there are many things related to normal life and sports that I feel that I have learned.
Yeah, and I mean what you said earlier about your book, that it's maybe half of it is about sport and half of it is about life. And I guess we all would do well if we remember that sport is, part of life and part of the bigger picture of asking questions about what is good life and what is the role of sport kind of in that good life, and how you reflected on what's the value of Olympic gold. I mean, that's a thing that is contested as well now that we have a lot of these stories in the media about athletes who actually won everything, but they still didn't. In the bigger picture of their life and looking at all what it took to win that medal, we can then ask these questions whether it was all worth it or not.
Exactly.
So it's really been a wonderful discussion, and I can't emphasize enough how much I look forward to reading your book. I happen to have this insider knowledge that this is not the end of your career as an author, as a writer. So you can tell a little bit about your new project and where it is going at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. I decided when I was writing a story about Alekkos that if it will be published in one day, I will continue writing, because I had a nice idea about sequel. And in sequel, it's actually I have done it. It's ready in my computer, and now I'm correcting it and changing the rhythm of the text and some words and blah blah blah. That kind of background work before I give it to publisher.
So just to interrupt, your first book was published about 2-3 months ago, right?
Yeah.
And you have already written your second book. I'm absolutely amazed.
Yeah, but I signed the contract between me and publisher 2019 September. So then I started immediately planning the second book. So I collected all the data or information for about 2 to 3 months, and I started writing the second book somewhere in the November 2019, and it was ready in June 2020. So after that, I've been correcting and doing these things, but
right.
So it came much faster, even though that's huge book too. If Alekkos has 750 pages, I would guess that this sequel will have 500 or 550. It is actually, Alekkos is also there as main character. He's going to North, to the court of Philip II, who was the king of Macedonia, and he he was the father of Alexander the Great. And I didn't want to write a book about Alexander because there are like loads and lots of information and stories about him. So I wrote a book about his father, who was actually the one who established the first Western national state. So he was the one actually who combined finally this all violent or hostile Greek city-states. So it's about a book how he did it, and it's more about a book about what is to be king, about the kingship and justification of one person, and you can easily compare his story or achievement to Putin, Erdogan, Trump, Xi Jinping, Bolsonaro, and this kind of guys who is like they're not kind of tyrants, but in a way they're not like showing democratic values either for me. And it's, I would say it's more simple idea than what you can find in Alekkos.
Okay. And in your second book, is there something in relation to sport?
Yes, actually there is. Alekkos will come 3 more times to Olympic Games.
Okay.
In the first book he was there 364. Next time he arrives 8 years later, and then 12, and then 16 years later. And I would say that he is pretty successful in those games.
Don't tell me more, but just hold it back for a little moment. It will take me some time to read these 750 pages of your first book. So yeah, what a wonderful discussion. It's really exciting, and both the book itself that you have written and also your own story of how the book also reflects your own questions and your own search for what it means to be a human and what it means to do sport, both back in the day in ancient Greece, but as we discussed today also about what is it about to do sport in our day as we are talking about it. We talked about some of the dark sides of sport. You mentioned about game fixing and cheating and those things that were present back in the day and are present as well now. And you talked about some difficulties that the Finnish Nordic combined has gone through. So I hope we can finish off with a little bit more positive note. So maybe you can talk about your team today and how the Nordic combined is doing in Finland and what kind of goals you have with your athletes at the moment.
Yeah, sure. It's Nordic combined. I really love the sports. It's somehow there is so-called pure values, if you let me say it in that way. Like what I mean is that there's no doping involved, not that big money, and we are not that super much like media in presence or media impact, or how do you call it? But yeah, it's still like very popular sport in Finland. We are. I hope that we are giving lots of good moments, good feelings for our audience, spectators are looking for what we do. We have now, or I've been head coach for this team 8 years, and I still have 2 more years left in my contract till the spring of 2022, and there hopefully there's also Beijing Olympic Games before my contract ends, and we are heading. Our goal is to heading for Olympic gold medal, and yeah, I think we have really successful and very potential team in our hands. There are some World Cup podiums already behind us, and yeah, it's just a bit unsecure times because of the COVID. But we are heading to the next winter, which should begin. I think that's the end of November. The exact date is 27th of November in first World Cup competition in Ruka, and then we continue the winter season. And we have a new coach from Austria helping us in ski jumping side, which has been the biggest challenge so far. And it's very interesting to see if we have solved our main challenge in jumping hill, and if we can do that, then I know that we can be a really successful team. And yeah, that's what we do. We travel with 200 days a year with the team, so it's really professional what we do. even though, like I said in like before, that there's not like big money involved. So it really, the motivation has to come from inside, and the money is not a driving thing for on what we do. But still, I feel that we do something big and something very important with great passion and with big love of sport and Nordic combined.
Yeah, best of luck to the new season, and let's hope you will have a wonderful journey towards your big goal. So thank you so much, Petter, for discussing with me today. I feel I learned a lot, and I got very interested in learning more about sport in the ancient times. And yeah, just like I said, best of luck.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here, and all the best to you too, and have a nice autumn.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcast or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.